Last week, we had Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Alvin Kamara, James Cook, and Kyler Murray go off in fantasy football, and they helped people win their matchups. This week, I'm bringing you 10 names that will do the same in week 3. My hit rate on these videos so far after 2 weeks is 75%. We've hit on 15 out of 20 names. The first player that I believe is going to dominate this week, if you got this guy, you feel like you found hidden treasure. This is Tony Pollard versus the Green Bay Packers. My running back 17 on the week. Green Bay gives up the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs in fantasy football this year, on average giving up over 25 points per game. Check this out. Packers defense versus fantasy running backs. Saquon Barkley in week 1, 3 touchdowns, 130 plus yards. He put up 33 fantasy points on this defense. Then Jonathan Taylor in week 2, 135 total yards. He was averaging over 8 yards per carry. And then Shane Steichen, the genius he is, decided to bench Jonathan Taylor for the 4th quarter. JT could have had a huge game. He had 15.5 fantasy points and only played 3 quarters. The Packers' rush defense is so poor. In 2024, they're giving up 142 rushing yards per game. They're top 6 in yards per attempt allowed at 5.1 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. And total yards allowed per game, they're giving up the 6th most yards per game to opposing offenses. And Tony Pollard has been that dude for Tennessee this year. I mean, his averages in 2024 so far, 16.5 carries, 5 targets, 21.5 touches total, over 98 yards, and 16.8 PPR fantasy points per game. Guys, shout out to Mike Wright from the Fantasy Footballers who talked about this recently. Running backs with 15 plus carries and 4 targets in 2024. Here's a list of running backs with 15 plus carries and 4 targets in 2024 in every game. Tony Pollard, that's it. Only Tony Pollard has been able to do that. And even better news, Tajay Spears might be limited this week because he is dealing with an ankle injury. He says he's going to play, but he will be limited. I think we see Tony Pollard with at least 90 yards, 5 targets, and 15 plus PPR points. The second player that I think is going to dominate in week 2, you might love him just like me, Jameson Williams versus the Arizona Cardinals. I have him ranked as my wide receiver 21 this week. Arizona gives up the 10th most fantasy points per game to fantasy wide receivers in 2024, giving up over 28 PPR points per game. How about Jamo, baby? Full-time Jameson Williams is so electric. It's so fun to watch. He has been on fire to start the year. He's a wide receiver 7 overall through 2 weeks, and we are going to continue to ride that wave. The best part is we aren't just relying on big plays anymore. Jameson Williams is getting consistently targeted in this offense. In fact, Jameson Williams is top 5 in targets in the NFL. Only Cooper Kupp, Malik Neighbors, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Zay Flowers have more targets than Jameson Williams this year. And this Lions offense is looking to bounce back after losing last week to the Bucs. And the Cardinals, this is a great matchup. This is beautiful for fantasy purposes. The highest over-under of the week. So the sports books think that there will be a lot of fantasy cheese in this one. The Cardinals are coming off a 40-point game. Their offense is on fire, which should be a good game script for the Lions needing to throw the ball. I think we'll see Jameson with at least 4 catches, 85 plus yards, and a top 24 finish here in week number 3. And this brings us to our spicy, hot, bold take of the week. We do this every week. Here it is. The Cincinnati Bengals bounce back in a huge way on Monday Night Football versus the Commanders. Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase both go off. They are both top 5 finishers at their position, top 5 quarterback, top 5 wide receiver on the week here in week number 3. Check this out, okay? I've got Burrow as my quarterback 4 in my rankings, Chase as my wide receiver 1 in my rankings this week. Washington, I'm a Washington fan if you know the channel, and I keep telling you guys to play your offensive players against Washington's defense. Straight cheeks. We are literally the worst secondary in the NFL. We have given up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks in 2024 per game. We have given up the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers in 2024. Over 44 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Friendly reminder, in week 1, I begged you guys to start Chris Godwin against this defense. In week 2, I begged you to start Malik Neighbors against this defense. And if you look at what those guys did, Chris Godwin had 22 fantasy points and a touchdown. Mike Evans had 2 touchdowns, over 23 fantasy points. Malik Neighbors had 127 receiving yards, a touchdown, and over 28 fantasy points. All right. How about the quarterback position? Okay. Well, Baker Mayfield in week 1, over 29 fantasy points in 6-point passing touchdown formats, and Daniel Jones with 18 fantasy points. Guys, If a defense can make Daniel Jones look decent, it is a terrible defense, okay? This will be the best play the entire year. The Commanders' defense in 2024 is giving up the 4th most points per game to opposing offenses. And just to further my take, Vegas believes that this will be a bloodbath. This is the largest spread of the week in favor of the Bengals. The Bengals' implied team point total is over 30 points in this matchup. I believe Joe Burrow throws for 3 touchdowns, 250 yards, and he's a top 5 quarterback. Jamar Chase, 7 catches, 100 yards, a touchdown, and 23 fantasy points. These guys are going to remind people who they are in week number 3. All right, let's go on to my 5th and 6th player. Another little package here from a team, Jordan Mason and Brandon Ayuk versus the Rams. Just traded Brandon Ayuk away in the Flock League. I know I got roasted a little bit for it, but I still think he's going to be fantastic. Still love Brandon Ayuk. My RB7 for Jordan Mason this week. My wide receiver 12 for Brandon Ayuk this week. The Rams give up the 4th most points per game to running backs in 2024, and they give up the 9th most points per game to wide receivers in 2024. Let's look at what running backs have done versus the Rams. In week 1, you had Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, both over 16 fantasy points, both got into the end zone. James Conner in week 2 had over 123 total yards and 19 fantasy points, and he as well got into the end zone. How about wide receivers when we're thinking about Brandon Ayuk here? Well, in week 1, Jameson Williams put up 24 fantasy points. His career game, his best ever game so far, Jameson Williams did it against these Rams. And then in week 2, Marvin Harrison Jr., another young player who has their best ever career game versus this secondary, over 29 points, 2 touchdowns. I mean, this is the matchup to target. Look at how bad this defense is, guys. Rushing yards allowed this year, they're 3rd. Yards per attempt, they give up the 3rd highest yards per attempt at 5.5 yards per clip. Passing yards allowed per game, they're top 10. Total yards allowed per game, they are number 1. No team in the NFL gives up more yards per game than the Rams right now. And if you look at points scored per game against this defense, they are 2nd in points allowed at over 33 points a game. No Aaron Donald is killing this rush defense. It's killing this defense overall because there's less pressure. You got to start this pair. By the way, shout out to Dwayne McFarland who tweeted this out. Brandon Ayuk over the last 3 seasons without Deebo Samuel on the field. A 29% target share, 45% air yard share, and a 2.92 yards per route run. He is going to dominate. I've got Brandon Ayuk with 80 receiving yards, a touchdown, 19 PPR points, and Jordan Mason with over 80 yards and 15 plus PPR points. All right, the 7th player, you got to start Travis Etienne at the Bills, my RB15 on the week. The Bills have looked really good this year, but their rush defense has not been the best. In fact, they have given up the 4th most points per game to fantasy running backs through 2 weeks. In week 1, James Conner over 19 points against this defense. In week 2, Devon Achane went crazy. We know in PPR formats, he's getting so much work in the air, but we know James Conner also did his thing. And here's the deal with Tank Bigsby. Originally, Tank Bigsby did look like he was going to be a problem, but on one of the first plays of last week's game, he gets injured. He doesn't return to the game. He hasn't practiced yet at the time of recording this video. I don't think he's going to be a factor. And Etienne has touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. He's used in the air, will continue to get 70+% of the snaps. You know, 3.5 targets per game at the moment. But if you think about game script right now, I think he's going to have a season high in targets versus the Bills, especially if this team is coming from behind. 70+ total yards, season high in targets, 15+ PPR points. Okay, the next 3 names are the ones that make me the most nervous to talk to you guys about. I'm not going to lie. All right. There's good reasons to start them, but I got bubble guts when I'm telling you to start them. The first name, Kyle Pitts versus the Chiefs. Can we be honest for a second? Who in the world can predict what tight ends are going to do on a week-to-week basis? I don't think it's ever been more difficult any year. Even the top names are a wild card at this point. Kyle Pitts, my tight end 4 on the week. Kansas City is getting destroyed by tight ends. They are giving up the most fantasy points to tight ends in 2024. So in week 1, Isaiah Likely comes out, puts up over 26 points on this defense. And then in week 2, Mike Gesicki revives his career out of nowhere. 7 catches, 91 yards, and over 16 fantasy points. Clearly, losing L'Jarius Sneed has hurt this defense, and they're trying to kind of overcompensate in other ways. So tight end is just an open target most times versus this defense. I think we'll see Kyle Pitts with 5 catches, at least 60 yards. All right, the 9th player we're going to talk about is Christopher Olave versus the Philadelphia Eagles. My wide receiver 15 on the week. I know you don't want to hear me talk about Chris Olave, but I think there is a lot more hope than people are realizing. I think you should have a much more optimistic look for him after week 2. Okay, I'll explain. In week 1, they never needed to involve Olave in that blowout versus the Panthers. In week 2, Olave had 7 targets and Derek Carr only threw the ball 16 times. Guys, Chris Olave had a 43% target share in this offense in week 2, and no one's talking about it. Again, they didn't need to throw the ball. Derek Carr threw the ball 16 times, guys. This is a great matchup. If you look at it, Philadelphia gives up the 2nd most points to fantasy wide receivers. Last week, we told you to start Drake London. Okay, what happened? Drake London comes out, puts up 17 PPR points. Darnell Mooney also on this defense, 17 PPR points. In week 1, we told you to start Jaden Reed. What happens with Jaden Reed? 33 fantasy points. Right now, this is still a matchup that you can target. The Eagles are good offense. They're going to score points. You're going to have to throw on them, and most people are able to do that. With Chris Olave, I think he puts up a season-high 90 receiving yards, 15 PPR points. And the last take, I'm not going to lie, guys, this is the most nervous take I have had this entire year, but I really feel like you can actually start this name, truly. That is Zamir White. Carolina gives up the 2nd most points per game to fantasy running backs, on average over 29 PPR points. In week 1, Alvin Kamara dominated this defense. Over 5.5 yards per carry, 22 fantasy points. In week 2, J.K. Dobbins dominates this rush defense. 7.7 yards per carry, over 100 yards for both of these guys, and 20 PPR points for J.K. Dobbins. What people don't realize is that this defense already lost their best interior defensive lineman in Derek Brown, so they're getting even worse. But look at where they are on the year. They are top 10 in rushing yards allowed per game. They're 2nd. In total yards allowed per game, 8th. In total points allowed per game, 1st. In yards per attempt allowed, they're 9th. They're giving up almost 5 yards per clip. I believe Zamir White finally gets used properly. 80 total yards, 1 rushing touchdown. This might be the only week you can actually start this guy moving forward, so definitely put him out there. I appreciate you guys for hanging in there with me. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you soon. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.